add value to your business, or do you want to just be this administrative person?
And often, if you look at your talent team and the caliber of talent in your company, they correlate.
You could hire the best person for the job if they were in your candidate pool.
All these individual employees, one by one, together, their voices all come together to articulate the culture of the company.
The paradox of a world with increasing automation is that you've got to have people who are both more facile working with computers and differentiating themselves from computers.
That rumbling you hear is, surprisingly enough, not my stomach, nor that of my co-host, Miss Lisa Holden. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning, Sean.
No, that rumble is the audible buzz of HR Tech 2018 attendees wandering around the show floor. But lest that distract you, we have an intellectually stimulating super guest for today's show. That was a bashful look of confusion, I might say, but we'll run with it. Today we have sitting across from the Hiring on All Cylinders crew, Mr. Josh Wright. Josh is the Chief Economist with iCIMS. Good morning, Josh.
Good morning. Pleasure to be with you.
So excited to have you. And so for our listeners that might be scratching their heads wondering, what does a Chief Economist do exactly? Josh, can you kind of give us a quick rundown? What does a Chief Economist do, and what is kind of the work that you're doing look like?
I spent a fair amount of that doing that myself, scratching my head while I'm trying to scratch my chin as well, thinking over some of the thorny problems out there in the labor market. So as the Chief Economist at iCIMS, I wear a bunch of different hats, actually. I work with the data science team to get a sense of what is the data that we can find in our system that is generated by our users that we can extract in order to generate new kinds of insights about the labor market and the hiring landscape. And then I work with the marketing department to find ways to get that out into the public's eye. I do some work with customers as well. I speak at conferences, but a lot of it is about trying to understand how can we bring new ways of thinking about the labor market. I also do a fair amount of tweeting and blogging about current events and economic topics. I still work with government data and interact with the media about these kinds of issues to stay abreast of understanding the bigger picture, not just what is our view of the world, although it's a unique and important one, but how that fits into a larger picture of what's going on out there.
That is amazing, and I'm sure, Lisa, that resonates with you. So for those of you that are not familiar who Lisa Holden is, Lisa heads up communications for Intello, and so I could just see her nodding and getting super excited as Josh is explaining that.
I'm nodding and getting excited about what Josh is saying because I know that he sits on a treasure trove of data, and the sophisticated analysis that he can do with that data is really, really something. So I'm so excited to have you on the podcast to talk about that. And I'm exhausted just hearing about everything that you do on a day-to-day basis. It's a big job. So congrats to you, and we're glad you're here. One of the things that you mentioned you do a lot of is speaking, and I understand you're speaking at this conference. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're talking about?
That's right. We have a very exciting session coming with Foot Locker, and that's going to be a real tag team operation. I'll be working with their head of talent acquisition. I'll be setting the macro picture and the backdrop of what's going on out there that is shaping the world of retail hiring, and then Robert Perkins of Foot Locker is going to zoom in and talk about the specific challenges that they face with their view of the world, the kind of workers they're trying to bring in, and the kinds of business problems that they are trying to solve with those people. So I'll be talking about the rate of job growth in the retail industry, how that compares to what's going on in the economy as a whole. I'll be talking about how they compete for talent and how they can upskill, how there's an increasing need to compete with adjacent markets, whether that is e-commerce and warehouse workers or it's leisure and hospitality. But in this tight labor market, what do you do to go out there and find the people that you can work with, even if they don't have the skills, all the skills that you'd like right now, or even if they don't have the skills that you will need in the future, how can you train them and upskill them? And then Robert is going to switch over and talk more about specifically their strategy for hiring and how iCIMS fits into that. And a lot of that is about simplification and centralization so that there's a consistent kind of interface for all recruiting workers at Foot Locker, wherever they are in the world, because this is a company with a global footprint, but also making sure that there's a consistent interface across all the different functions that they're using throughout their recruiting operation. So that's the individual talent acquisition point solutions that can be integrated into iCIMS, as well as how iCIMS can be integrated up into larger HRIS, HCM kinds of suites. I'm not sure. Geek alert here. Do we need to explain all the terminology, or
I love a geek alert. Maybe that's the highlight of this, or the headline of this podcast.
Exactly. Geek alert with Josh Wright.
We've got Josh Wright. Speaking with Foot Locker must be a very interesting way to have this conversation, because I imagine in retail there has been an increase in the demand for good recruiters in this space. I think retail is one of those industries where in maybe 10, 20 years ago, employers didn't necessarily have to go out and recruit talent for hourly workers at a brick and mortar establishment. But what we see changing in the marketplace is that now these companies really have to get incredibly strategic about branding themselves so that talent does, they do get that inbound talent that applies, and also being strategic about where they find these workers that they can then, move up the chain, maybe start in the brick and mortar and establish their careers with some of these organizations. So,
yeah. Absolutely. I actually want to jump onto that because it kind of goes what you were saying about it's sometimes also about cultivating that talent and saying the talent might not even be there to begin with. And so how can we maybe up level or help train those individuals to make the workforce of tomorrow to help us kind of progress past just, again, people applying for an entry-level, retail position? How can we actually make sure that people have the right skill sets?
Yeah, it raises a question: what counts as a qualified candidate? Who's qualified to have a certain job? Does qualified mean this is a wish list candidate, someone who can do everything that you're asking for? Maybe they've already done it in a prior job. That was the kind of job market we faced 5 or 10 years ago. Now, as the labor market has gotten tighter and tighter, it's more about finding what are the raw ingredients that go into a good worker. What can you work with, rather than sit around and demand.
This brings up the topic of automation very beautifully. And I think that something that's very interesting that we've seen is as automation becomes more and more adopted in the workplace in various functions, not just recruiting, but in all sorts of skills that can be automated, the skills that cannot be automated suddenly become the really, really important skills that you look for when you're hiring candidates. We see that all the time when it comes to recruiting automation. You can kind of put certain elements of your sourcing on autopilot, but then it becomes incredibly important to develop relationships with candidates and manage the candidate experience at a much more higher strategic level than you necessarily would have had time to do before.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of curious, you were kind of talking about working with candidates as opposed to finding the perfect candidate. What are some of those skills that you see as being the ideal kind of characteristics or traits that can be worked with to create a phenomenal candidate for any given position?
Well, I think that there's an issue in retail, and it's representative of what goes on in the labor market as a whole now. The paradox of a world with increasing automation is that you've got to have people who are both more facile working with computers and differentiating themselves from computers. Of course, those STEM skills are great. The technical expertise, and particularly programming and data science, you can't go wrong with developing those skills, because more and more in a world where robots and algorithms are in the workplace, you need to be able to interact with them in a sophisticated way. At the same time, you need to be able to add value to them, not simply get along with them well. And so that means what the so-called soft skills, the human dimensions, creativity, user design interfaces, communication, emotional intelligence, and leadership. We call these things soft skills, but there's nothing easy about them. It's not easy to acquire them. It's not easy to implement them. It's not easy to train them. It's not easy to determine how, to judge the performance and determine who's good at it and who's good at teaching it. So the future belongs to people who can accomplish this double feat of both interacting with the computers and algorithms in a more easy way, but also adding value, differentiating themselves. And that's true whether you are in some kind of advanced white-collar position or you're in the storefront of a retail company where you've got to make sure that the darned automated cashier actually works, but also manage the relationship with the customers and make sure that it is a smooth and seamless experience. And that's exactly what you're talking about, Lisa, with recruiting. Right? You've got to be able to use these sophisticated tools but still deliver an engaging and smooth experience for the candidates.
Yeah.
That brings up our next topic very beautifully, because something that we grapple with a lot is the notion of whether or not robots are here to take our jobs. And the line that we often hear is that robots aren't necessarily here to take our jobs, they're here to give us a promotion. And so when you can collaborate effectively with those robots in the workplace, you sort of find that happy medium. And you see this in other industries too, by the way. If you look at how doctors can use machine learning and automation to help them make a better diagnosis. The machine on their own does okay. The doctor on their own does okay. When they work together, that's when you see the highest level of success. So we're seeing that in
Yes, and that's just on the technical merits, what you're talking about, but then there's this other dimension, how you're going to interact with the customer or the patient or the candidate. And there's a statistic that I saw on Twitter just this morning talking about how the vast majority of people would prefer to get a diagnosis, to receive a diagnosis from a human rather than from an algorithm, even if they were told the algorithm was more accurate. Now, they didn't talk about the margin of accuracy. You can get into the details, blah, blah, blah. But the principle is clear. The bedside manner, that's not going away. That's what humans require, and that's what humans are best at delivering.
So I would love to kind of shift gears a little bit, and you said that you do a lot of research with the data that you kind of sit on top of, the treasure trove of data, as you mentioned, Lisa. What research are you currently working on, and is there anything you can share with our listeners?
Sure. Well, we're very excited that just this past April, we launched a monthly hiring indicator. So taking a look at hires and openings, and just a couple of weeks ago, we added regions. So now you can see by region or at the national level what hires and openings were for the latest month. We deliver that within a couple of days of the end of the month. Sometimes beforehand, we have a little projection. And we're looking forward to adding more features to that, such as cities, because we know that a lot of recruiting is really locally based. You want to understand a pretty tight area because you're trying to source for a particular location. We're also taking a look at our salary data and how we can bring that out, because what's fundamentally useful about the data in an applicant tracking system, you see the people who applied, you see the position, you see the people who applied to it, and you see who got hired. Yeah. And that's really the magic. That's the gold in social science, because it's effectively an experiment. You run this experiment over and over again, all these people who are applying and who actually gets the position, and what were the features? How did their skills compare to the skills required in the job? How did what kind of salaries did it take to bring them in the door, whether it was on the original job posting or in the final offer letter? So we're looking at mobilizing the salary data. That's more of a medium-term thing. In the near term, we're looking at questions about labor mobility, which has not been super well understood in our economy. We've got data on the demographics of how people move over time, usually very lagged, and we just see where people are moving. We don't see how successful are people applying from one place to another. For the people who are trying to get to Silicon Valley, get to California, are they all coming from within California? If they're not coming from California, are they coming from the West? Or are they coming from the Northeast? Or are they coming from all over the country? These are the questions we're excited to look at.
There's so much there. I mean, and I think like labor mobility, I think the idea of salaries being an experiment is one that definitely resonates. I mean, it does kind of seem like, where do these numbers come from, and how do people dictate, okay, this individual gets more money, this individual may get a little bit less? How does that all work? I think an experiment is probably the most effective consolidation of that craziness that is salaries.
Yeah, we're headed towards a world of increasing transparency in the labor market, and this is going to be one of the big frontiers. There's already a big kind of crack in the vessel that hides some of this information from job candidates through Glassdoor and other job review sites, but getting actual hard administrative data, not just self-reported, that's something else. And also important to remember that on the professional side, I was talking to a compensation expert the other day. He said, yeah, there's some great surveys out there, I rely on them, I trust them to a certain extent, but I would love to see your kind of salary data, because the survey data is primarily based on people who are currently getting paid. It's not telling me the going rate to bring someone in the door today. And that's what's unique about hiring data. And that's what you get from an applicant tracking system.
Brilliant. Well, it sounds like one of your predictions for the future is that things are going to become more transparent. Do you have any other predictions for where the labor market's going?
Well, I think that's going to make life, unfortunately, harder in some ways for recruiters, although it's an opportunity. I know, sorry, recruiters. But as you know, Lisa, you were talking about the idea of it's an opportunity to promote yourself. It's an opportunity it's to move up and increase your skill level, because the reality is that this is an arms race and it continues to mount. So as the labor market becomes more transparent, candidates are going to become better informed, and you're going to have to up your game in order to compete with that. Because for a long time, it's been that there are these professionals, the recruiters and people within HR, who spend all their time thinking about how to bring candidates in the door, all their time thinking about what's the right price level, what's my negotiation strategy when we get to negotiating the final offer. And the candidates, they usually interact with these questions once every couple of years. But now that's going to change, because this information is going to be available to them. They can upskill themselves very rapidly to be ready to come to the negotiating table in a much more sophisticated manner. And that's, by the way, that's just so far we're talking mostly about bargaining for the final terms of coming on board, but then there's a whole world of recruitment advertising, and that's changing too. Yeah. So I think that in a world where consumers are, so much of their experience these days is mediated online, and it's seamless and it's engaging, they're going to expect the same kinds of experiences from the recruitment process.
Yeah. And talking about having those conversations more frequently, not every 2 to 3 years. I know that currently there's almost this understanding that like the boomerang, right? Going somewhere else and then coming back will actually up-level you more quickly as far as salary, as far as prestige within a company. Do you see maybe this transparency getting rid of that to the point where those conversations can happen more readily, and instead of having to leave your company to come back and make more money, you can just constantly essentially prove that you have up-leveled yourself, up-leveled your ability, and then be able to negotiate more effectively?
That's an excellent point. I think it definitely increases bargaining power for workers across the board. And so in the end, that's going to make it easier for them to stick around. I don't think that's going to mean that the boomerang effect is going to disappear,
Sure.
But there will be some people on the margin who won't have to go through that.
Yeah.
I think that how that will play out in the near term is going to be interesting, because there actually could be more people who boomerang. When you increase the labor market literacy levels, then there could be more people who are aware of these practices. Now, and then the second wave effect may be, well, maybe we don't need to. Now that this is understood, that we are more liable to jump, that flight risk has suddenly risen, once you've proved that point and proved your power as a worker, then maybe the game starts to shift. So I think it could be a little bit more complicated than that. And of course, by the way, this is going to happen it's going to happen at different rates across different companies and different populations. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. We tend to talk in these general terms like, oh, the labor market this and the hiring landscape that. The reality is that there are many different labor markets and many different hiring landscapes. So the terrain is going to be, even as we move towards more transparency, which in the long run should lead to a more level playing field, it's going to be more uneven in the near term, because who's going to seize those opportunities as these early signals start to leak out?
I think that could be an entire additional discussion on a separate podcast. That's really, really fascinating. And I think we do forget about that terrain. And who knows? Maybe the next negotiation factor won't have anything to do with salary, because there is so much data available and it's so transparent. It'll be about something else, like work-life blend or...
blend. I like that.
They're saying blend, not balance now.
Oh, that's intelligent. Well, I think the other thing is it could be more of contingent salaries. You could see the rise of more pay for performance. I know there are a lot of debates about, pay for performance was a big catchphrase, I think, for the last 10 years or so, and I've heard some HR wonks opine that that's going to disappear and something else will take its place. But I think that having more transparency, that's going to probably lead to people saying, well, okay, let's work that out and see how it goes.
Yeah.
Because we have a better understanding of what the value of the worker is.
Well, I think, talking about pay for performance, it relies on heavier transparency across the board. Like if you don't have clear-cut either OKRs or goals or quotas, then how can you actually have effective pay for performance that actually encourages people to pour themselves into something and perform better if they don't even understand how that goal that you've set for them is going to benefit the overall organization to begin with?
Yeah, you can't put that in an algorithm, which brings me back to another point that we've talked about a couple of times here, but the idea of differentiating yourself as a human relative to an algorithm. I talked about the soft skills of communication, leadership, design. Something I left out actually was ethics, because you're raising an ethical question. How do you judge value? What are the judgment calls? We're not going to trust the computers with that. Even to the extent that we do, is going to be programmed in by a human.
Yeah. It's the trolley problem. It's everywhere.
I feel like we could keep this conversation going for hours, but we have to let you get to your next appointment. Josh, remind folks where to learn more about you and your company and where to find this rich report you speak of.
Absolutely. You can go to www.icims.com to see the company. If you add a / and hiring-insights, you can go and see my landing page where you've got my blog. And you can also see the latest releases of the monthly hiring indicator, although you can also do a / for monthly hiring indicator. And then you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @JWrightStuff. J, Wright like the brothers, and then stuff like all that stuff.
That's amazing. I will definitely go follow after this, if I'm not already. Let's put it that way. Josh, thank you so much for coming and joining us.
Thanks for having me. Have a great conference.
You too.